So it's a great pleasure for us, privilege for Soillse, to introduce Professor François Grin from the University of Geneva, a renowned scholar, not only in sociolinguistics, but in economic sciences as well. He's been a leading thinker on these issues, especially the issue of trying to blend thinking in the economic sciences with the social sciences for language minorities. Now, he has a long-standing involvement with Soillse. He's been on the board of directors, and he's been a great support to all our endeavours. So we'll ask Professor Grin to address us, and there will be time for questions afterwards. So, Professor Grin, thank you.
Hello, bonjour, Martin Va. Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much for the Soillse team for this invitation. I'm really happy to be in Stornoway again. It's my second time here. And it's not my second time in Scotland. I've been here many times. I think it's an extremely interesting part of the world, and I'm extremely happy to be able to take part in this event. And again, it's a pleasure also to be specifically here on Lewis. And what I'd like to talk about today is language policy and planning in very broad terms. And more specifically, I'd like to start out from the observation that we are going through very challenging times in the field of language policy and planning, or LPP. It's never been easy. I mean, LPP has always been something quite complex, but it's currently going through a rather challenging period. And these challenges stem from three converging evolutions. One is that sociolinguistic reality is becoming increasingly complex, and this has an impact on how language processes unfold and how they respond to policy. Then we have challenges on the front of research, more specifically. And research, I believe, exists in order to help us make rhyme and reason of a complex reality, but also to help us not just think the fact. And it's currently beset by a gap between different ways of accounting for this reality and different conceptions of the role of research in society. And then public debate is frequently waylaid by the influence of the so-called social media, which encourage what is known as ultra-crepidarianism. That's one of those nice words that we will come back to later. That's why there is a little colored asterisk next to it. We'll come back to the definition and implications of ultra-crepidarianism in a moment. I'd like to preface my intervention by saying that what I have to say isn't intended in any way as taking a stand on the current issues that currently that the Scottish language policy is currently confronted with. I wouldn't have the confidence for this anyway, right? What I'd like to do today is to speak at a more general level, and I hope that what I have to say cuts across many of those debates in the hope of being more generally useful. Because I think certain principles apply pretty much everywhere if we want to do good work. And that's what I'll try to talk about today. And more precisely, I'd like to take a closer look at the triple challenge that I've just outlined. And of course, it means brutally simplifying some aspects of the question. I'll try and highlight some features of the public policy approach to language policy and planning. Thinking about LPP as a public policy, something that has not happened just like this. There were some inklings of it at the very beginnings of the development of the discipline, but then to some extent the discipline, I think, has been waylaid by recent developments. And I'd like to show how and why returning to some core competence of the public policy approach can help us meet this triple challenge. So let's start with those that come from sociolinguistic reality. Traditionally, LPP, language policy and planning, had to deal with relatively self-contained issues. I mean, historically, much of it began with the question of newly independent countries in Africa had to choose a language for the operations of the state. So much of it began with fairly, well, still complex, of course, question, but fairly self-contained one. And then there would be other issues that came to the fore, how to arbitrate the role of different official languages in a multilingual country, etc. But these were pretty much separate. But largely because of globalization, different issues are increasingly intertwined or interconnected in many ways. And in many jurisdictions, not everywhere, that means Swiss, not everywhere, but increasingly so, and in an increasing range of cases, developing a language policy means that you have to think simultaneously about all kinds of things that before you didn't really need to take in stride simultaneously. So, for example, you need to think in terms of different scales, the local, the regional, the national, the supranational, the global, because there's increasing reciprocal influence between them. Then there is the problem of different types of sociolinguistic situations, what I've just alluded to a few seconds ago, minority language protection and promotion, but also the integration of migrants, the communication systems that you need for multilingual structures, international organizations, multinational corporations, etc. All these things are increasingly interconnected as well. And then in terms of domains, you may remember this very traditional notion of domain of language use, like school, work, etc. These things increasingly influence each other. For example, school, leisure activities, media, all these influence each other more than before. So there is a more fluidity between those contexts. And all this makes things, pretty much, they were complicated to begin with, and they're not getting any easier. In addition, there is also the well-known problem that every case is unique, right? We're trying to have some general principles for action, but every case is the special case. And this creates tension between what is unique and what is general. We try to develop general scientific knowledge, but apply it to specific cases. And which is why I think we have to integrate the concept of LPP, language policy and planning, into the broader frame of the management of linguistic diversity. And the problem then is how to achieve this. It has to be done at three levels. One is the level of theory, abstract concepts and relationship between them. One is the level of empirical work, how to observe reality, how you account for it. And then, of course, there is a level of action. How do we act on linguistic reality through language policies? So for all these reasons, sociolinguistic reality is becoming objectively more difficult to understand and more difficult to influence through policy. This is the first of the challenges. Let me move to the second one. There are challenges in or to research in language policy and planning. And this is an area in which I've been, working more intensively in the past couple of years. This could deserve a talk of its own because it's complex. It also opens up onto a fascinating range of questions of intellectual history. But in a nutshell, and I'm really brutally oversimplifying things here, there is something which we might call classical sociolinguistics, which is associated with a whole range of big names. A very well-known one is that of Joshua Fishman, who passed away 7 years ago. And Fishman is known for his work on, for example, reversing language shift. And it's being challenged by alternative perspectives. I'm not trying to say that, Fishman, that nothing's happened since then. Of course, certain of the constructs that he thought about were marked by his times. And of course, we have to move beyond them, but it's important not to throw the baby away with bathwater, right? So I think there are some important fundamental elements, foundational elements that remain from classical sociolinguistics in general, excuse me, and that not losing sight of those foundational elements is important, provides us with a compass. But we are confronted with alternative perspectives whose main problem, I would say, is not that they are questioning or possibly rejecting parts of the heritage of classical sociolinguistics. I think the problem is that, and on this I am definitely taking sides, they are often at variance with established canons of scientific research. Such is the quest for objectivity, the confrontation with facts, the debate over whether these challenges, what do they exactly entail? What do they mean? And whether they should be taken seriously or not. I think they should be, but perhaps not for the reasons that their proponents imagine. Now, these challenges turn up, of course, in various strands of research across the social sciences and humanities. And for those of you who are interested in this, there is no end of debates about that have spilled over into the general debate. There is no end of discussion about where exactly we should draw the line between what qualifies as scientific, what is good science, and what is essentially opinion. So the recurring feature that you find, thank you very much, the recurring feature that you find in these alternative perspectives, which I think are a problem for research in language policy and planning, is first of all a strong emphasis on discourse, studying discourse, commenting discourse, instead of studying reality. Now, I'm not saying that it's uninteresting to study discourse. I'm just saying that it's not enough, right? It's part of it all, but it cannot be, the alpha and the omega of it. Whereas a lot of current research focuses on discourse. There's also a strong difference towards the notion of objectivity and objective knowledge, which are sometimes criticized as pure constructs whose main function is to buttress and just social order. But, I even came across some papers that say that, that mathematics as a discipline is inherently racist. Well, no, I think that mathematics belongs to everybody, and mathematics is a tool that we can use for good purposes and bad purposes. But let's not confuse the two things. And there is also, in these perspectives, a strongly relativist streak. So because of the influence of those strands of research, which is currently quite a strong influence in the field of LPP, scientific research is becoming more difficult to use to understand reality and influence it through policy. Now, we also have challenges, a third group of challenges that come from the way in which public debate unfolds. Public debate is being impacted by the so-called social media. Some people call them the asocial media, and I think there is something to be said about this. Personal opinions that used to be confined to discussions at the local club are nowadays spilling over on the internet through various platforms like Twitter and Facebook. I hasten to add that I have both a Twitter and a Facebook account and that I never use them. These opinions, and that's quite independent on whether they are well informed or not, have simply, and let me emphasize this, zero representativeness. Zero. And the mainstream media are giving them far too much importance, much more than they ever would have to discussion at the pub. But when I hear, for example, a major radio station saying, oh, how are the social media responding to this? It's like saying, well, what did Mr. Smith and Mrs. Meyer say at the pub yesterday? It is at that level, right? And there is, I think, appalling stupidity on the side of some of the media in the importance that they give to what is absolutely non-representative. Maybe interesting, but let's not pretend that it necessarily represents a general opinion. I think they do this largely in order to generate clicks, and the media then, of course, have an incentive to emphasize the more extreme opinions that turn up on the social media. And this encourages, and here we are, ultra-crepidarianism, that is the habit or act of giving opinions on matters outside the scope of one's knowledge. This has always been there, also in pub discussions, and I certainly I'm guilty of it myself quite a lot. But the problem is the visibility this is receiving. And this visibility is given usually for pretty dubious commercial reasons. And it often provides illustrations of Brandolini's law that the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than to produce it. So we really are getting a public debate that is getting polluted by a so-called social media. Hence, it is becoming more difficult for citizens to debate in a way that helps them to identify problems, discuss solutions, and build consensus in order to move to action, including the LPP. So what can we do? Well, it can do essentially three things. First, go back to the essentials. What is the language question or problem we're facing? Sounds obvious, right? But if you look at some of the current literature, you'd be surprised at how far away it seems to be from such a basic question. How do we understand it, and how do we analyze it? How do we decide what should be done to alleviate or even resolve the problem? For this, we need to use appropriate tools. One is the general framework of public policy analysis. This is what I'm selling today, right? Second, more specific parts of it, one is called the policy cycle, and even more specific, the program theory. And then we need to apply a standard pragmatic strategy when dealing with language problems, which means, and let me just detail this, but I will afterwards only focus on the bits highlighted in red type. First is to approach the problem as an empty box. structured only by the three essentials at the top of this slide. Stick to robust scientific methodology, and we'll see what it means or what I believe it should mean. Think in terms of plausibility instead of proof. Absolute proof in our trade is almost impossible. We're not doing physics or chemistry in a lab. So we can't have absolute proof, but we can compare the relative plausibility of different ways of looking at reality and different ways of accounting for what goes on. We should combine various methodologies in the study of the real world, quantitative, qualitative, various forms of fact finding, and of course be deeply interdisciplinary. And that was one of the messages of this European project that has yielded the two books that Conchúr has mentioned before. It is probably the most interdisciplinary endeavor in language policy ever produced, because we had 11 or even 12 participating disciplines united around a question, which was dealing with the multilingual challenge of Europe. So as we shall see, the concept of effectiveness is pivotal in implementing the strategy that I'm just trying to outline. So let's get started. First with the policy cycle. So this is textbook material, perfectly banal, and I hope this is not too repetitive for some of you, but this is the sort of thing that if you do public policy, you will certainly come across at one point or another, the policy cycle. And this is a slightly different way of applying the policy cycle that we're currently working on with some colleagues for a handbook in language policy that should be coming out in a few months. And it is structured around 5 successive stages or steps, if you want. The emergence of a problem. People become aware of it. Then it's a recognition as a problem that deserves to be taken on board or addressed as part of the political agenda. So the politicization of it is in the public sphere, in a private state at least, is necessary. Then you have the very heart of it, very core of language policy, that is the formulation of a policy plan. And I will focus the rest of the talk on that third box. After which you have the practical implementation, and then ex post, you evaluate the policy to see what has worked and what has worked well, not well, more or less well, and why. So in the policy cycle, I think what's important to point out is that it is a very open and flexible instrument. And contrary to what I'm getting increasingly tired of hearing, it's not some kind of intrinsically technocratic or neoliberal or top-down exercise, because it can be used in a very open and democratic way. In fact, it provides a frame for actors' experience, knowledge, expectations, demands, self-priorities, values, etc., feedback, reservations as well, to be taken on board in the study or the diagnostics of the problems at hand and in the formulation of various policy responses that can be considered. So box number 3 is particularly important there. It's called, policy formulation, if you want, and we'll see that we can actually call it program theory. It is the policy formulation and adoption, which connects the means and the ends, what you use and what you're aiming at, in their broader sociolinguistic, political, economic, and social context. So let's look at program theory. So there is a nice way of saying this. It comes from a textbook by Rossi, and it says that program theory is a conceptualization of the policy program, the plan of operation, and that where it gets really important, the logic that connects its activities to the intended outcomes. Or if you want, the rationale for why it does what it does. Really looking at what is happening in people's lives around the use of this or that language. Looking really, this means that under those conditions, but perhaps something different under other conditions, but looking at this quite specifically. So it is focused on causal connections between what we do and the effects of what we do. And the effects can be reached more or less effectively. Some measures are simply more effective than others. Effectiveness here means making a difference, right? Making a difference in the direction designed. So we're not talking about efficiency. I'm leaving out efficiency completely. Efficiency means effectiveness per unit of cost, right? How much do you get per pound, dollar, franc, euro spent, right? No, effectiveness is simply, well, does it make a difference, and does it make a difference in the right direction? And ultimately, whether what we do is effective or not is something that can only be judged with reference to the goals pursued. Effectiveness, having an effect, means bringing us closer to a goal. Otherwise, the notion of effectiveness is meaningless. So you have to be very clear, very explicit about the goals that you want, knowing that there can be several stages in those goals, but this has to be spelled out. So we can summarize this with this little flow chart, basic flow chart. We have some inputs or resources that generate some outputs or direct effects of a policy, which are just way stations, because what really matters is the outcomes, the effects of the policy, but in terms of the goals that actors are aiming at. For example, the increased use of a minority language. However, in this chain, all kinds of elements of context are really important. And even if we could assume that all these elements of context are somehow subsumed under the blue arrows that already appeared in the preceding slide, it's often easier to think about policy if you make these surrounding conditions or these elements of context quite visible. So you can feature them here in this slightly augmented version of program theory. You have inputs, outputs, and outcomes, just as before, but then you have all kinds of surrounding elements, conditions, events, which impact on how inputs translate into outputs, but more importantly, how outputs translate into outcomes. This affects the processes whereby what we have done will ultimately deliver what we hope it will, or what the policy is intended to deliver, such as increased minority language use, for example. So when developing a policy plan, we have to think about all this. And I think, looking back on these, flowcharts, it seems pretty obvious. It seems pretty obvious that we have to use a consistent theoretical approach, that we should know the terrain, feel quite well, and collect solid empirical knowledge about real-world processes. We should think about all this in terms of what works and under what conditions in order to achieve certain goals. Pretty obvious, right? Except that, and the related questions of efficiency, I'm leaving out for the time being, although we can talk about it later if you want. However, and this is, quite striking, large tracts of the currently very popular alternative perspectives that I've just talked about on LPP, they just don't operate along those lines at all. They propose lots of interesting perspectives on language policy and planning, but they typically fail to think in terms of measures and goals, focusing instead on specific features, possibly sub-features of LPP. And the type of understanding they offer is per se interesting, and it can be fitted into the broader frame of the policy cycle, in particular stages 1 and 2, potentially 4 and 5. But it conspicuously, most of the current literature conspicuously avoid box number 3, which is really the heart of the process, right? And I think much of the current research in LPP simply avoids, they sidestep, they shirk, whatever, it avoids the very hard work of examining cause and effect relationships, which are complex, which are operate at multi-level, which are a bit messy, where we never have proof, but only plausibility. But essentially, they skirt much of the important effort to assess how certain measures produce certain outcomes under certain conditions. So for this, I think we need to apply 6 basic principles. And this is in very small print, so I'm not going to go through all this. No worries. I'm just going to highlight the big idea, and then we can come back to this if you want. First, let's maintain the distinction between the positive and the normative. One of the problems with current research is that they keep mixing it up all the time. But the fact that a statement is morally satisfying does not mean that it is more factually true. These are 2 different things. They're both relevant, except they have to be kept separate. I have some examples there. We can go back to those examples later. But let's keep studying. What is true and what is right are simply, they belong to 2 different realms or spheres of discourse and analysis. Second thing, and this may bring back, school memories for some of us, is let's never affirm the consequent. It's a basic problem in logic. Affirming the consequent is that, if we observe a certain situation A, it couldn't be explained by fact B. But Just because we observe A doesn't mean that fact B is also true, is also observed or potentially observable, because situation A could also have arisen from some other cause C, right? So just to give you an example, we observe that the lawn is wet, but it doesn't mean that it's just been raining. Perhaps someone has just been watering the lawn. So let's be very careful about these causal links. And it is surprising how much of the literature falls prey to this basic logical fallacy that we often hear about at school. Let's also bear in mind a pretty classical precaution. Correlation doesn't mean causation, right? So the one that I use with my students is this way. Now, most people lie in their bed, and therefore the horizontal position is lethal. Right? That's a correlation. It's a pretty strong one too. So also choose the proper counterfactual to assess whether a policy works. It's not enough to compare situation before, situation after. Sometimes you can approximate this with this tactic, but it's not necessarily true, because if you had not implemented the policy, perhaps certain things would have happened anyway because other elements on the outside take place, right? So you have to construct your comparison in a slightly different way to establish a point, set it in a satisfactory way. And all these principles, in fact, are closely, they kind of flow into each other. They're different facets of the same logical point. Let's also keep alert to the difference between a necessary and a sufficient condition, right? Suppose that A must be present for B to happen as a consequence, but A is not enough. Perhaps C also needs to be present, therefore A is necessary, but not sufficient. There's a whole example here about immigrants and success on the labor market, and is it linked to language or not? There is all kinds of fluff in research about this, lots of faffing around, simply because people ignore this very basic distinction between a necessary and a sufficient condition. And then last one of these 6 principles, then I'm pretty much done, is let's not lose sight of generalizability. I've said on the one hand that, of course, every case is a special case. But life being so complex, we have to think in terms of categories. We have to think in terms of variables and general relationships between those variables. But at the same time, we should bear in mind that if we observe something that holds in a certain case, it does not mean that it will hold in another case. Context really matters. And it's just a matter of navigating this tension between specificity and generality or generalizability, something which has to be done probably throughout the process, and that we should not lose sight of. Again, all the foregoing may seem very obvious, but it's simply surprising the extent to which large tracts of scientific media and political discourse about language, about multilingualism, about language policy seem to either neglect those basic scientific principles and skirt the very important basic question of what works, why, how. So the question of effectiveness, ultimately. Dealing with the problem, if identified as such, as in the policy cycle that I've just highlighted before, will sooner or later call upon us to propose solutions to resolve it, or at least improve things. And solving or alleviating a problem is the goal of the policy. In some ways of dealing with a problem can prove more effective than others. So any discourse, insightful as it may be, can be very insightful denunciation of the power structures which are embedded in a certain discourse about foreign language education, et cetera, Nice. But a discourse that does not propose ways to reach certain goals by adopting certain measures and referring to some kind of causal connections can be very interesting analysis, but it is simply not language policy. So language policy is really focused on this. We need to refocus on clearly identified notions of goals and effectiveness. These notions provide us with the compass that we need to protect and promote small languages, among other possible goals when managing linguistic diversity. And this is, I think, particularly true. This compass is particularly necessary in contemporary societies in a globalizing world. And I think the logic behind all this is best summarized. Again, let me go back to Fishman. And he, in his book, Reversing Language Shift, he's got this, I think, very nice encapsulation of the problem, where he says that it's hard enough to row against the current, but it is virtually possible to do so without knowing where one would like to get to and why. But live. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.